Hey guys, so most of us have come across situations in our lives where we just need to communicate that one message, that one idea with both precision as well as with clarity. And I think the issue here is that sometimes that's necessarily easier said than done. And I think honestly one of the toughest parts about any of these activities, whether it be email writing, speech making, or just generally conversation making, is that it's just sometimes just a challenge for us to figure out where to necessarily get started, how to do that perfect, masterful introduction. And so if you're like me and you're trying to figure out how to better structure and share across your ideas, and specifically how to give that killer introduction, then hopefully this episode will be useful for you. As this is with this being essentially the second part of my review of The Pyramid Principle, a book by Barbara Minto on how to better structure as well as communicate your ideas as well as your thoughts. I'll be essentially sharing across with you an idea that I found quite clever in the book on how to essentially give that killer introduction that will help to set the tone for the rest of your presentation. Hi everyone, so welcome back to my channel. My name is John and I am an Economics and Global Studies graduate from Monash University. If this is your first time tuning in to one of my videos or to the channel as a whole, then welcome. And just some context about me is that essentially what I do over the weekdays is that I do full-time brand marketing. It's my first job actually. And what I do there is that I help to manage and care for a brand's health as well as its overall growth. And specifically what that involves is everything from helping to bring in new products and new ingredient variants and new artwork for our brand, so as to ensure that our products remain relevant to our consumers, all the way to working towards helping to develop television commercials or digital commercials, or forming partnerships with influencers to ensure that our products always have that top of mind presence with our consumers. And if that's what I do over the weekdays, then essentially what I do over the weekends is that I manage this YouTube channel where I talk about the triumphs and challenges of my work, the joys of downtime and hobbies, and finally, honestly, just anything in between and anything else that I think would help to add value to both my life as well as hopefully your own as well. Alright, and on the subject of essentially adding value, I actually wanted to start off this second part of the Pyramid Principle review, the book that I'm essentially working my way through right now for either the third or the fourth time, but essentially now with a view towards documenting as well as sharing whatever insights that I pick up along the way with all of you guys. So to start us off for this particular episode, I wanted to actually start off by reading a quote that I found right at the start of the book. And essentially it's a quote by Kurt Levin which says, "There is nothing so useful as a good theory." And honestly, I think it's with that idea in mind that I want to reshare across with you guys today and essentially delve into more detail on the SCQA framework that Barbara Minto outlines in her book. So for those of you who may not be familiar with this framework, then definitely do check out part 1 of this The Pyramid Principle review series that I'm doing now. There will probably be 5 parts essentially, with each part covering 2 chapters of this 10-chapter book. And essentially what this framework is all about, for those of you who haven't yet seen this video or who may be unfamiliar with the framework in general, is that it stands for the Situation, Complication, Question and Answer framework. And essentially, it's a narrative and storytelling device that Minto outlines as well as explains in her book, which she also demonstrates as being useful for essentially helping us to set the tone as well as set the context for whatever it is that we want to say within our presentation, within our piece of communications, as well as overall to help us just give that killer, clear introduction that we all, I think, just want to give whenever we are speaking or communicating an idea or message that's particularly important. Okay, so the Situation, Complication, Question and Answer framework, or the SCQA framework, is essentially composed of 4 substructures, each substructure representing an idea that you want to make sure you introduce and communicate towards your audience whenever you're doing any sort of introductory world building or introductory storytelling. And if we take it step by step, each structure step by step, then we start off with the situation, which essentially represents that status quo, that current state of events that your audience will already be familiar with. And so what you're doing is simply reminding them of it, essentially. And from the situation, we then move towards the complication, which essentially represents that alteration towards the status quo, that change towards the current state of events that would be problematic, or essentially would be the point that you will want to highlight, or the problem that you will want to highlight towards your audience. And from the complication, we move thereafter towards the question, which essentially arises out of the complication, and essentially, if answered, will address and solve the complication. And from the question, we finally move towards the answer, with the answer essentially representing the approach, your approach and your solution towards which if implemented will help to address the question and solve the complication that you have planted within the minds of your audiences. And essentially why each of these substructures is so important to the overall framework, and why the overall framework is so important to any sort of introductory storytelling and introductory world building, it's because it sets that initial context to engage and pull in our audiences and to essentially let them know that what we're about to tell them and say to them within our piece of communications is going to be relevant to them. And it's going to be relevant to them because we would be answering and helping them to address a problem which they can understand, which they can perceive to exist, because we would have taken the time to allow them to understand its origin as well as to plant it within their minds in the first place. Okay, so now that we have a brief understanding and a general overview of the SCQA framework and each of its corresponding substructures, there are two things to keep in mind when we are preparing to give that killer clear introduction. And the first thing to keep in mind is that when we are essentially communicating or doing that introductory storytelling, while each of these substructures is essential and crucial towards the overall framework, it can at times be possible for us to leave implicitly stated certain of the substructures rather than explicitly or outright stating them. And what I mean by this is that, for example, when we're communicating a complication to our audience, it can sometimes be self-evident what the question would be, in the sense that when we're telling someone a change has occurred towards the status quo, or a problem exists, it can sometimes be self-evident that the question would simply be, what should my strategy be then to address this change in the status quo, this alteration to the current circumstances, or this problem that you've told me exists. And so if the first point is simply that it can at times be possible for us to leave implicitly stated certain of the substructures when doing our introductions, the second point ultimately to keep in mind is that each of the substructures, while crucial towards the overall framework, can be resequenced and do not necessarily need to flow from one to another in a fixed manner. And what I mean by this is that in Minto's book, essentially, she outlines 3 different ways and correspondingly 3 different tones and effects that we can create depending on how we sequence each of the substructures together. Okay, and now to give you guys a feel for how we would actually reframe or restructure the same introduction just to create these different tones, let me actually play back for you how I did the introduction for this video, because if you guys hadn't noticed, I actually opted for the option 1 or the considered approach when I was doing the introduction for this particular episode. Hey guys, so most of us have come across situations in our lives where we just need to communicate that one message, that one idea with both precision as well as with clarity. And I think the issue here is that sometimes that's necessarily easier said than done. And I think honestly one of the toughest parts about any of these activities, whether it be email writing, speech making, or just generally conversation making, is that it's just sometimes just a challenge for us to figure out where to necessarily get started, how to do that perfect, masterful introduction. And so if you're like me and you're trying to figure out how to better structure and share across your ideas, and specifically how to give that killer introduction, then hopefully this episode will be useful for you. As this is with this being essentially the second part of my review of The Pyramid Principle, a book by Barbara Minto on how to better structure as well as communicate your ideas as well as your thoughts. I'll be essentially sharing across with you an idea that I found quite clever in the book on how to essentially give that killer introduction that will help to set the tone for the rest of your presentation. Okay, so if that was how you would structure a considered approach, then this might potentially be how you would consider structuring a more direct approach. Hey guys, so I've just finished chapters 3 and 4 of the Pyramid Principle, in which I've discovered a clever formula by Barbara Minto on how to not only give a killer clear introduction, but one that's also suited towards your style and your purpose. And in that most of us, I believe, come across situations in our lives whereby we need to communicate an idea with both precision as well as with clarity, but find it difficult to do so, specifically in even figuring out how to even get started at times. I believe this principle would be ideal to help us in those moments. And so if that effect might be more useful if you want to come off as being more direct with your audience, then if you want to let your audience know that you are particularly concerned over the subject matter that you are talking to them about, then you might want to opt for this final, more concerned approach. Hey guys, so understanding how to communicate our ideas is tough, and arguably one of the toughest parts about it is just figuring out where and how to get started. And honestly, this is a tough spot for us to be in the sense that I believe for most of us, sometimes it's just expected or required of us that we're able to communicate our thoughts with both precision as well as with clarity. And ultimately, it's because of this that I'm so glad I've come across this framework, this theory by Barbara Minto in her book The Pyramid Principle, in which she outlines how to give a killer clear introduction. And not just a clear introduction, but one both suited towards our style and ultimately our purpose. Alright, so that's how you would go about giving a killer clear introduction, depending on your tone, on your style, and depending on the overall purpose of your communications, and via employing the SCQA framework. So this was a particularly long video, but I do hope that for those of you who did stick around to the end especially, that you guys found it useful in some form or shape, perhaps in just getting a better understanding of what the SCQA framework's all about, and also perhaps in just being able to start seeing and playing around in your head about how you will go about employing this framework in your own speeches, in your own future pieces of communications and writing. But do let me know in the comments if you guys found it useful, if you guys liked the insights that I shared across in this part 2 of the review. And if you guys if you guys definitely want to see more content, then do leave a like, do subscribe to the channel, and have a good weekend you guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one.